Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fighting on Film. This week we're very excited to be joined by Jenny Grant, a postgraduate researcher focusing on the Polish experience in Britain during World War II. And we are going to be taking a look at this week films that look at the Polish 303 RAF Squadron. And we're looking at 303 Squadron or Squadron 303, or it depends on what poster you look at and in what language it's in. And we're very excited to take on this one because it's quite interesting in the way it's approached the subject matter, isn't it?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it's very disjointed, isn't it? It's not the most technically adept film that I've ever seen, but then again, it's not the worst film I've ever seen. I don't know where I fall. Maybe by the end of the episode, I'll know definitively how I felt about it.
So, Jenny, as our guest, I mean, what did you make of the film?
Yeah, so I mean, it came out in the same year, doesn't it, in 2018 as Hurricane. So it's so hard to sort of not compare the two.
Yeah.
And they're both coming from a sort of good place, which is they've both got the sort of Polish-British cast. They're kind of trying to do parallels between, like, you know, the Poles arriving in Britain and the challenges facing them. And you know, they both have sort of releases in Poland. The Hurricane film is pretty strong. It's obviously got, you know, this main lead, which is Ewan Ryan, isn't it? And so Polish film doesn't have anyone with the same sort of name recognition.
At least not in the UK.
Not in the UK, absolutely. I mean, the sort of Polish cast in Poland is really, really strong. So this, it's really, as you were saying, I think disjointed is the key word. It kind of makes this claim that it's sort of rooted in Fiedler's book that comes out during the Second World War. And you're kind of hoping for sort of historical accuracy, or at least some of those really sort of powerful moments that he captures in his book, where we look seen at the sort of heroics of Squadron 303. And instead, you sort of come out for just going, is it me? Am I stupid? What's going on here? And it's one of those where actually you do have to watch it about sort of, you get a reward at the end of it where the kind of, it all comes together and makes sense, and they kind of reveal who everybody was supposed to have been. But you're just puzzling your way through it. It's more like sort of Christopher Nolan than anything else, and not deliberately, you know.
Yeah, it's not great when you have to wait to the end credits for the film to go, oh, that's who that was supposed to be. Yeah. Because
it possibly could have done with maybe saying that, you know, at the start, maybe like these are fictionalized recreations of the people. So maybe if you'd have known that going in, we might have been a bit less harsh on it, possibly, because we would have known going in that, oh, this is a fictionalized account. But the movie sort of from minute one wants you to think this is the genuine people and the genuine history. It falls down for me there, where I'm just like, oh, okay, what are you trying to do here? You're trying to do a real story, you're trying to do fictionalized, because halfway through, for me, it turns into some weird soap opera, you know, evil villain-esque general character with this femme fatale that goes nowhere. And doesn't even get resolved. And then, oh, great, they're all part of this multinational big wing squadron that is going to win the Battle of Britain for us right at the end. And then credits. And I'm like, oh, what happened? There's nothing happened in this movie. It's so weird. I don't know what you felt. What happened?
Well, it does. It sort of starts off in a fairly like interesting way, and it has them in Britain, and it gives a couple of little flashbacks which are quite neat and tightly done, and it explains, you know, the invasion of Poland and the background of some of these the guys. But then it just sort of in the middle, it sort of just fades off, doesn't it? And it just becomes a little bit of a mishmash, and then it ends in a very odd way. Spoilers that the king arrives. There's a dog, and there's a couple that we've never seen at any other point in the film.
Oh God, yeah, forgot about them too.
Women's RAF member chases a pilot to a plane and says, "Don't go," and then they kiss. But he's never been seen on screen. She's never been seen on screen, and it was clearly only done for sort of like the trailer. I think that's my guess.
This feels a bit
that was a very bizarre way to sort of like end it. And then it obviously does do that big wing thing where they form up and it's CGI and there's various different. Oh, it's the Polish chaps.
Yeah, and the Canadians and everyone else. And you're like, this is really nice, but could we not have had this halfway through?
It doesn't even end on the big wing. It goes straight into this victory parade, doesn't it? But it's
Oh yeah, of course.
American. And you're like, oh, and then there's ticker tape. You think, well, that's weird because this is the thing that really got me. Like, clearly the whole point is it's very sympathetic to the Polish experience and very critical of the British, but it misses like these really obvious opportunities to sort of show, like, you never see the Poles fighting back against the Germans in 1939. You never see any of that. We get a brief discussion of the tactics, but then they rock up in the UK, so we assume that failed. You never see them fighting in France. I mean, by the time we get to the Battle of Britain, some of these guys have like faced up against the Germans twice already. And then the victory parade is like the absolute go-to for like this sense of like the British Polish community sense of betrayal. Like they weren't invited to it, and some of the pilots were in the end, but then they don't go in solidarity with the rest of them. So why you would be missing the opportunity to show the Poles at their absolute best and the Brits then at their worst in a film that's trying to win us over to the Polish position just seems such a weird decision.
Yeah, it's the choice of stock footage to use at the end, isn't it? It's like Times Square ticker tape parade, as you said, and it is really jarring because obviously if you don't know your stock footage or your history, you'll just think that's a generic VE Day celebration.
It's most likely a post-production error, or the stock footage that they wanted was just too expensive, and they didn't know the difference.
Yeah, it's a bit weird, isn't it? Because it's a shame because all the other stock footage that they've used is pretty good in context. It's bombed out London, it's hurricanes and Heinkels and Dorniers flying around, so it is in context, and that bit at the end is just a bit weird. I feel the same as Jenny. I don't think it really fits. We
were saying sort of earlier, you never get a sense of where they then go afterwards. I mean, the kicker is like most of them can't go back to Poland, can they? No. So they make their lives in the UK, or they emigrate to Canada or the US and so forth. But it just seems, again, a really bizarre one. I mean, it's way better than the Hurricane one, where there's the suggestion that Zumbach has to leave or he'll be deported back to Poland. The Polish Resettlement Corps was created to deport Poles, which is like absolutely the opposite of what it was created for. So it avoids that crime, but it just leaves us with, oh, well, that was fine. And you think, again, that's a very weird way to end it.
So I think on that note, we should probably just give a bit of an overview, well, as far as we can, of the plot, and then dive into it a little bit more after that. So we're following the 303 Squadron, and it's principally Zumbach's character that we follow, isn't it? Jan Donald Zumbach. And we're introduced to his character, and then we have some flashbacks of a little bit of a love interest with a female pilot trainer. And then there's a little bit where he is trying to get in contact with her, and then he eventually gets some letters. It's all a bit just disjointed. And then we intercut into that is some dogfights, some clashing with British officers, and then there's a few little bits where they've clipped in where it's sort of how they got to Britain. There's a little bit where they've shoehorned in a hospital being bombed, which kind of sets up the German ace character a little bit as being a thoroughly bad chap. And then there's a bit where the Russians shoot some Polish wounded, which is obviously another sort of box to tick for what they assume to be their audience, I think, if that's fair to say, because you have to show that Poland was invaded, from both directions. We sort of end around mid to late September 1940, just as the Battle of Britain is getting to its zenith, and then
it poises that 5-second big dogfight as the big main battle, doesn't it? Over in a couple of minutes. If you're culminating your whole movie to this one point and you've used all your CGI dogfight up earlier on in the movie, just save it. Because I don't think the CGI is awful. I think it looks good enough. Definitely seen a lot worse. It's not like they've got in the people from War Thunder and they've just filmed like a video game. Yeah, it's not someone just playing a video game. It's purposefully done. It's probably tailor-made. It looks nice enough.
There are some bits where the continuity is a little bit off. So there's a bit in one of the dogfights where he goes to sort of do a barrel roll, and it then just cuts to him flying level. And then there's a little bit where I think it's after Paskovich shoots down the Bf 110, which is shown in all movies that involve the Poles, obviously, because it's the first Polish kill. It sort of shows a Messerschmitt fly off rather than a Hurricane, if you look very closely, because you can see the yellow nose. And I was like, oh god, that's very weird. So there's continuity errors, and you're right, the CGI is better than say Hurricane, which is quite boring and static. At least this does show some ducking, diving, weaving, and what you expect to see in a dogfight.
$4 million budget. I mean, I think they did what they could. Where it was good in the CGI, it might not be entirely 100% accurate in the way planes fly or whatever. I'm not an expert in flying, but then the film really lacks for its setting and its scene and everything else. It just is really lacking. It just feels really flat. It's not clearly not filmed in Norfolk or anywhere near Kent. It's a shame.
I do think that was like budget restraints, because you just look at it and you just go, you look at they save on location, don't they? So like Denver is a goddamn mansion. This is where they train, and there's 5 of them in a tent. And then like Norfolk, you've got 3 squadrons, you've got a concrete runway, it's North London, for heaven's sake. There's buildings left, right, and centre, and you get the impression that it's a couple of huts, and then these guys, surrounded by wilderness.
I think it's the same field, isn't it? Just shot at a different angle.
Yeah,
Clearly.
It's like different times of day. It's and then there's that bit where they finally achieve sort of celebrity status, and it's like fantastic. We're gonna, they've had a couple of nights out at the Orchard pub. That's fine. It's like, right, big one here. Come on, let's do that scene in the Dorchester that you get in Hurricane, where they go and they sort of meet all the sort of British socialites and so. Oh no, we're back at the Orchard pub, but this time we're being brought around. I mean, wow. Okay. Again, it's just very, very sort of strange, sort of penny pinching, isn't it? And I do understand it's better to have made it than not, but there's just an awful lot of tents.
Well, that's it. But then they have like scenes where they'll go back before the war, and they're in like a nice sort of dining room in a restaurant somewhere, and they meet the German ace or the German officer, and that's all very lavishly produced and quite well done, but we don't get that elsewhere. And then it's quite dark and dingy in the bits that are supposed to be the Dorchester. There's some very bizarre bits in the film where there's a bit where one of them takes up a violin, and it's almost like Back to the Future, where it's like, your kids are going to love this, and they all start dancing.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't. It's very odd, and I suppose it's trying to like do this thing where they show that the Poles have a lot to offer, not just by fighting, but culturally. They have a lot to offer, which is great. I appreciate that. It just doesn't really fit in to that part of the film very well. It's just a bit weird.
It's really interesting to say that, because like you read like Fiedler sort of reflects back on his original book, and he's saying that was the whole point. It was to persuade people to see the Poles, not as sort of superheroes, but just as and he's trying to get to the heart of that sort of British exceptionalism thing of other people, just other people, and trying to sort of win sympathy. But throughout, he's also, his book plays this major role in boosting morale in occupied Poland. So again, you've got like this idea of 2 audiences already then, that feeds back here. But it's just like you're being beaten over the head repeatedly by how evil the Brits are. It's like, when you watch like The West Wing, and it's like sort of, it's Aaron Sorkin, it's beautiful, characterization's perfect, and then you get the single British character, which is it Lord John Marbury, and like he's this old Etonian, and like he's a chap what hunts, and it's like that plus like the officers of the Death Star. Like there isn't a single Brit in there, is there?
Everyone's speaking in received pronunciation.
Absolutely, as well.
Even
but
the barman.
I feel like this is Roselit, for God's sake. I mean, this is it's weird. It's
I think that's just obviously it was overdubbed as well, so we have to like sort of put that into context. There's a bit where there's a speech. Which character is it that delivers the big speech? And
is that the Ivanovich one that he does in English, which makes...
That's right, it is. It's the Ivanovich one where he says, we're here, we are Polish army. Give those bloody Germans hell. I'm assuming, I'll give the film the benefit of the doubt and assume that speech that he gives there sounded much more coherent and a lot better in the original Polish, which is super weird because I don't know why they decided to dub that. He would have given it in Polish, because at that point he's addressing the Polish squadron, because the English officer's just spoken and it's fallen a bit flat. So he steps forward to give a speech, but then he does it in English. And it's just like, well, why aren't we getting that?
Yeah, and the language thing's so key, because I mean, actually, a lot of them, the Poles, they spoke French.
Yes.
So, like Athol Forbes, who's like this malevolent Tim Henman character, like, I mean, he spoke fluent French. He had a really good relationship with them on the basis of that. And you see that for a moment where you've got Zumbach speaking to Jones, wanted to track down Ugoda, and he says, could we speak in French? But then they don't do that consistently. And then actually it turns out a lot of the time their English is fine. You think, oh my gosh. And then,
from a viewing point of view as well, that really is jarring, because I think the first two lines of the movie are dubbed, where it's like, oh, we're flying for freedom, and then it cuts. Like when they're in their what are they called? Not barracks. What are the little hut things? Yeah, when they're like little hut on the airfield. And goes,
little Quonset type barrack thing.
Yeah, like we're flying for freedom, and that's dubbed. And then they're talking Polish with subtitles. Then there's not. Then sometimes there is. And then the Germans speak German with subtitles. And me and my wife, we talk about it a lot, because she did film at university, worked in corporate film for a number of years, and she's like, you're never quite sure if a movie is really good when it's dubbed or when it's subtitled, because you can't appreciate the original language, the actual language that's being spoken. You can't appreciate it as it's not your native tongue. So you're not sure what you're watching is good acting or not.
Yeah.
I think it's where the film falters for me, is if it had just been in Polish and German with some English characters, I'd have been happy, because I'd have just read the subtitles and it'd been fine, and I could have appreciated it a hell of a lot more. But because there's so many different languages being spoken, and there's such a change in, when there's subtitles and when there's not, when there's dubbing, it just really confused me by the end. And that's why I couldn't keep up with the characters. I couldn't keep up with plot lines, because I was either doing too much reading and trying to get into scenes, or I wasn't. I found it really coherent. This is the first time I think I've watched a film for the podcast where I've come away and I'm thinking, what the hell did I just watch? Me and Matt, I was texting Matt afterwards, and I was like, Matt, I found that really difficult.
Yeah.
And there's all the reviews that I found for this episode. There's one from the Radio Times, and it was by James Luxford, and he gives it 2 stars out of 5. So did the Guardian actually as well. And they say, emphasizing the heroism of real life pilots, the movie displays a sincerity in its message that is unfortunately not matched by spectacle. It looks cheaply made and struggles to balance a multi-language script that mires itself in melodrama. Plot points are abandoned with frustrating regularity, and characters' motivations aren't always clear. The aerial combat is thrilling at times, although it's not always terribly clear, and again is held back by switches in language. It's an ambitious but flawed film. The true story behind 303 Squadron is a lot more interesting than this basic reenactment. I think he hit the nail on the head there, really.
Before this, we were talking, and Jenny, you were saying that it wasn't particularly well received in Poland either. And there's a Polish film website called FilmWeb that gave it, I believe, 4 out of 10, which is indicative of that, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's got really good popular Polish actors behind it as well to sort of bring them on side. The chap who plays Urbanowicz, I mean, he's Adamczyk. He's great. Like, he's played the Pope, he's played Chopin. He's a really safe player for everyone. The thing I found awful also was that it's almost like they've snagged these 2 excellent actors and then couldn't really decide who the film was supposed to pivot around. So you've kind of got some like to begin with the love story, and then they bring sort of Urbanowicz in, and then they've got like this file where Victoria, the sort of PA chickie, is supposed to sort of lay this honey trap for him, and they've got this big file, and there's a bit of me just going, oh god, these guys don't even have documentation attesting to the fact that they're pilots, because occupation and everything. Where the hell did you get a file on this chap? And why did you get a file on this chap? And why are we now and then she hits on him and then doesn't succeed, and then he just goes and sort of shouts at a priest angrily, and it's all very strange.
And she's meant to be an actress, and her motivation is getting back in films, and all that.
Well, they shoehorn that MI5 plot in there as well, where she's supposed to be gathering information on these Polish pilots, and she goes for Zumbach rather than Banowicz. Kent, I think it is, isn't it? Major Kent. He's very unhappy about this, and then he just plays a bastard the rest of the film. So when she falls for Zumbach, obviously, she's not a real person, by the way. It's a completely fictional character. Victoria Brown, played by Cara Theobald. She's doing what she can with the role, but there's not a lot there for her. And I think the most nuanced part is the bit where she breaks up with him, where she says, "I've gotten you a transfer," which I don't think is possible because she obviously doesn't have that authority.
No.
And he's obviously doesn't want this because he wants to be a fighter pilot, because he is a fighter pilot. And he refuses this. And she says, "Oh, well, I'm going to break up with you then, just leave." And it's all very sort of just, we're as stunned as Zumbach is in that moment, because we don't know what the hell is going on. And then the Major Kent character walks in, sort of clapping and saying, "Great performance." And she says, mission's over. I don't want to be a war widow," which then gives that whole scene a little bit more, clarity. It makes a little bit more sense.
But the fact she was an out of work actress who just happened to be working for MI5 is just completely abandoned.
Yeah.
I'm like, what? Like, it's so it just confused me. It fried my brain at points. I was like, but you've just set this up. Now you're setting this up. And there were three writers involved in this. And I think it's where maybe, as like going back a few weeks, where the Forgotten Battle fell down as well, because there were 6 writers on that. And I think sometimes maybe the vision of one is getting overtaken by the other, and they're all trying to get in their own little bits and bobs, and there's just not a coherent script.
Well, this was written by Chris Berderza and Thomas Kepsky. And it's, as we mentioned before, it's based on Fiedler's 1940 book, isn't it? I don't know if you want to give us a little bit of context about that, Jenny, because the book itself's fascinating and the aim he had for it.
Yeah, so I mean, when the sort of the Polish armed forces arrive in the UK, yes, they want to rebuild their military, but they've always got an eye on the fact that if they are attracting headlines, that's good for Poland, the Polish cause. And so you get all these books, called things like Poland Fights Back and so forth, where it's sort of looking at the Navy, and it's looking at the Army sort of on sentry duty, it's looking at, Carpathian Brigade. And they didn't necessarily expect the Air Force to sort of be the one that sort of took attention. So it actually, the British newspapers pick up on the Poles and 303 before the Polish propaganda machine kicks in. So Fiedler talks about going and visiting Sikorski, saying, do you want me to look at these guys? And then he spends time at Northolt. So from that perspective, yes, the book, I mean, he's a travel writer. His books are all these sort of really tight little vignettes of sort of poignancy and adventure and so forth. And he does apply that treatment, but it's a really stonkingly good book. I mean, everybody should absolutely read it. It was very much about sort of promoting the Polish cause, but it's very sort of open-eyed. It's not sort of triumphalist. It's not he's talking about these guys do this, but they're doing this because they're really well trained. It's not that we can just say that they're really motivated because they've had their country. It's not that simple. But that's really doing a disservice to them and to Poland. They are phenomenally well trained.
The film does get that across quite a little bit, doesn't it? It sort of emphasizes the number of flying hours, and it has that little training scene where they're having a lecture.
Oh my gosh! I mean, yeah. I mean, but that scene is one of the weirdest. So you've got like your squadron, and you've got the Poles sort of moseying around outside, sort of, because they can't, they're still in training, they can't get up. And then this young guy, the bell goes to scramble, and this single guy runs towards the plane, who is supposedly English and says he's had like 10 hours flying. But he's got a Polish accent, which breaks my brain at this point.
Yep.
And then, like, why are you stopping a guy running to a plane? And what sort of formation is this? You've got like a 19-year-old by himself going up to sort of face up again. I have no idea.
Minimum of 12 was supposed to go up, wasn't it, in a squadron?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know the Germans, where their budget stretches to 2 Germans, so they keep going up together and don't seem to meet anybody else either. But
I mean, I think we were lucky to get any Germans.
I think we were. Yeah.
But I think Fiedler's book is fascinating in that it's got all this great source material, but you were mentioning before we began recording that they just don't seem to use any of it.
No.
And that source material probably would have lifted the film.
Yeah, Carabin, you know, he's sort of chasing this German down, you know, the sort of Thames estuary and across some Rochester over to Canterbury, and then he realizes he's out of ammunition when he's finally, you know, so he actually comes down within 3 foot and then forces the German plane to crash. I mean, how good would that be? You know, that would have been all right. Or you've got the one where one of the chaps realizes that he's been hit and he's over the sea, and then he's escorted by these 2 other Polish pilots, and they maintain radio silence until they reach, and you know, his altitude is falling. Another really cracking scene. You know, all of these chapters are written with this in mind.
Yeah.
And none of that's used.
No, and it's even more bizarre where the movie has had like permission to use his book from the estate of Hitler. So why not turn his book into the movie? But then why not poise him as sort of you're viewing it through his eyes, almost like Ernie Pyle's film, The Story of G.I. Joe, where Burgess Meredith playing Ernie Pyle is like your focus, but then, oh no, the movie's actually about American soldiers in the war. Why can't you have done that here? Where you start off with this journalist is going to come write a book about you chaps. Oh, great. But then the movie actually turns out we're actually honouring 303 Squadron through his words. It's just an easier film to make, surely, with the budget that you have. It's really weird. You know, it's almost like they just want the recognition of using the guy's name and being able to use his name for the notoriety. And it's just a shame of what they end up with. It's really bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, you really need, like, you know, in Memphis Belle, where, you know, the journalist is introduced to all of the bomber crew, you needed that, didn't you? Because, I mean, I get to the end of it going, oh, God, that was Fran Tischek, and thinking, oh, for the love of God, like, I study this stuff. I had no clue. You're lost.
Exactly.
So you've got no idea who anybody is. You've no idea what time frame you're in. I think the big thing that I found jarring was comparing it like to the Battle of Britain movie, where you get the phases of the Battle of Britain. At no sense do you really know what's at stake. You don't get that from the British perspective. So you occasionally get the MI5 chap coming in and sort of talking about, oh, you know, we'll last for 2 months until the Americans join. And what the hell is that in itself?
Yeah.
But, you know, oh, they've bombed the airfields, or they've transferred to London, or where suddenly you've got the big one. It's assuming a huge amount of knowledge, but there's nothing to build on. I don't know if this dogfight's important at this stage or not. Exactly. I have no idea what's happening here.
Yeah, and that, I think as well, that might bring us on to the alley tally, so we can actually talk about some positives.
It's time for Alley Tally on Fighting on Film.
Jenny, as always, when we have a guest on, we let them choose their alley pick first. So what did you choose for a bit of kit or a bit of something that you loved or enjoyed from this one?
I mean, I think because they've got this reduced budget, they really make the use of the planes that they do actually have. So you get these really beautiful sort of photography. You've got the sort of hurricane on the field at sort of dusk, and it kind of, you know, the camera kind of licks it. It's really sort of lingering on it. And then you get really, really sort of detailed use of the hurricanes when they're sort of taxiing and they're taking off. And that sense when Zumbach first takes off, it is a gorgeous scene, and it is gorgeous use of the aircraft. So that's done phenomenally well, I think.
And that Hurricane is from the Historic Aircraft Collection at Duxford, and it's currently known as a Hurricane P3700. But it actually was built in 1942, and it was delivered to the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1943. And in 2015, to commemorate the 75th anniversary of Battle of Britain, it was marked up as a 303 Squadron Hurricane. So I think it's just one of the things that the film has in its cap, that it does have an actual Hurricane. And as Jenny says, the shots of it are nice. You know, if you're a plane fan or an aircraft fan, like, just gotta love a Hurricane. I think they just look.
Well, they are a bit forgotten as well, aren't they? You know, everyone thinks Spitfires, and that's.
Yeah. Personally, I really like to see them. They're always nice to see. And it was nice. I like. It's just nice to see chaps in having flying jackets, because they always look great, don't they? And the roll neck and stuff. It's all that iconic like RAF dress that you like to see in a movie. And that was good, I guess. You know, if I had to pick something else out. Oh, and before you move on, didn't have a Bedford water bowser or fuel bowser for their top scenes, which is criminal.
No Bedford trucks. No
Bedford
No
trucks.
trucks
I mean,
at
come
all,
on, they're
really.
ubiquitous. No, they had that weird.
Norfolk was very sparse.
Yeah, well, they've got a single member of the ground crew, haven't they?
Who just sort of like looks on or smokes his cigarette through his cigarette holder.
He's working his battle dress off, the poor boy, running around after them all.
Well, that's it. What, it was 8,000 Polish Air Force at the time, wasn't it? And that was split between aircraft crew and pilots. So we always think of the pilots. So it would have been nice to have a bit more inclusion of, one of the ground crew. But we get sort of like a nod to them. I mean, sticking with the Hurricane, I really liked all the shots through the reflex sights in the cockpits. So we might talk a bit more about some of those cockpit scenes later on. But I really liked how they showed that, and you get to see that in other films. You see that in Dunkirk really well. Actually, it's one of the positives of Dunkirk. Yeah. The cockpit scenes are quite good. You get that early reflex sight, which is like a reflected light onto a little plate of glass, and you can see the enemy planes. And you get lots of gratuitous sort of shots of the 303 Brownings in the wings going, and the bits of fabric flaking off from the gun cover, which is really
that
nice.
always looks
because
nice on screen.
You don't get that in Hurricane as much. Just to bring it back and compare it to the other 303 film, for the gun nerds out there, they were probably either FN N1939 Brownings or Browning Colt Mark II Stars. So they're the aircraft sort of variation of the Browning machine gun. And I suppose this is a good sort of point to talk about how long they were firing their guns, because that's something everyone always talks about when it comes to Dunkirk. We're like Tom Hardy's never-ending sort of ammunition. I think this film's guilty of that a little bit, perhaps. You get 16 to 19 seconds of ammunition in a Hurricane, slightly more than in a Spitfire, according to Anthony Williams, who has a book on aircraft armament that I've just picked that fact from. But they do show quite long bursts, and there's bits where you think, does the CGI designer know how bullets work, because they're sort of going all over the place?
Yeah. After the scene where the chap in Poland's going like, zeroing your guns to 150, 250, you think, well, if that's important for the script then and the film, then surely you should show the guys being really bang on with their accuracy then.
Yeah. Especially
Especially if they're pilots that have fought the Luftwaffe before in Poland and had 400 hours flight training.
And in France, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to maybe pick out my head, but I'd assume maybe the CGI just didn't have as much, chatting between the crew, perhaps.
Yeah, so they may not have had a historical consultant to sort of explain what was needed in those shots. I mean, we have some sort of gun camera footage from the war, obviously, that they may have used as a reference, and you do see sort of like tracer flying around, and it's quite smoky and not the clearest of things, but
Memphis Belle.
Yeah, that you don't really, they didn't really sort of get the concept of leading aircraft either, and aiming in front of them. It was always they were only fired when the red dot was lined up bang on the aircraft, which isn't super accurate, both in a real sense and in the film sense.
And you never see them taking down bombers at all, do you? It's all, I don't think, which is kind of what they're most famous for, was they would ignore the fighters and they'd hone in on the bombers. That's what they wanted to do, and you don't see a single instance of that.
It's because you've got to kill your German ace, haven't you? You've got to get him. He's the big baddie.
Well, yeah, you've got to wound him enough so he has a little scene at the end of the film where his commanding officer puts a speech sent to him on of, I think, Goebbels.
Gets moaned at by Goering on vinyl.
And then he very purposely, his arms in like a sling, held up, bandaged, and it sort of mimics a Nazi salute, and he very, very pointedly sort of like takes a pair of scissors and cuts that so his arm falls flat. And it's
in Harry Potter, where like Ron Weasley gets like the envelope and he opens it and it's like his mom shouting. It's that, isn't it?
It's that, isn't it? Yeah.
Goering envelope delivered by an owl. It's very weird.
I know you've got like 70% burns all over your body, but here's your flying marshal like Goering having a right pop at you, mate, and it's really mean.
And it's a really nice hospital. Like, it's got a gramophone, it's got wine. I mean, it was nice.
It's the spoils of war and taking over France quick, I guess. But it's weird because those scenes are quite technically really well done, and like that's where the budget looks like it's gone into those scenes at points. It's odd, isn't it?
Yeah, it's well lit, well shot, and then other bits aren't quite as well composed.
You feel quite sympathetic for the chap, like when you shouldn't, because they've poised him as this evil Nazi, horrible fighter pilot.
He bombed a hospital.
Yeah, exactly. And then at the end of the movie, you're like, oh, I kind of feel sorry for you because that's how the scene wants you to feel. It's a weird turnaround again. I'm like, but surely, no, I shouldn't.
It's a really clumsy sort of attempt to deal with the sort of the clean Luftwaffe myth, isn't it? You've got literally two Germans. One of them's good, honourable, internationally minded. He's got friends who are Polish and everything. And the other one's the sort of fanatical one. And in the end, I mean, that scene where he's sort of got his arm up in the sling and sort of the salute, and then his friend cuts it off, and it's just like, it doesn't go anywhere. I don't know what it's supposed, and then it could develop this, like there's loads of cases where I think it's Krasnodemsky who is originally the squadron leader of 303. So he's written out. That annoys me greatly. So you get Urbanovich being sort of promoted squadron leader, and Krasnodemsky is written out when actually he's there until the 6th of September. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, he goes down, he doesn't open his chute till until he's well out of the combat zone, because in Poland, the Germans had targeted the Poles that were parachuting out. And he's learned that. So again, you've got lots that you could have developed there without this very sort of klutzy sort of yin-yang two German chaps. It's very weird.
It's annoying, isn't it, when you know the actual history, when you know what actually happens and you see what gets put on screen. It just makes you angry, doesn't it? Because you're like, that's just far more interesting.
It's missed opportunities, isn't it?
Like
really?
On every single level.
And what makes it worse with 303 Squadron is it's had two efforts at this in recent years. And obviously we have the more iconic depiction in Battle of Britain, which is probably the best depiction.
Perhaps, I think so.
But these two just seem to be missed opportunities.
I think you're right. And before we move on from the alley tally, I've been wanting to ask an expert for years about this. So whenever you watch a movie and the 303 Squadron are portrayed in any sort of, even in Battle of Britain, they always go, no Polish chit chat on the comms, like very clipped officer says that. Is that based in fact, or is that for the camera? Like, is that for the narrative of a movie? Like, how is that? Where's the basis in history for that?
Yeah, so I mean, the big concern was when the Poles, this is September 1939, were kind of offering the services to Britain and France, and they wanted to be fighters, and the Brits were like, no, you can be in bombers, because the language problem with the Dowding system is so, you will never get over it. I mean, it just can't. But they end up having to. So you get these scenarios where they're doing sort of intensive language courses and so forth. But yeah, one of the difficulties is that, once they're up there, they get excited and they call out to each other, and they do it in Polish, because yes, they've been in the country for weeks at this point, and it doesn't seem to impact on their performance. So there's that element. But I mean, I think one of the key things is like the German discipline over the air was actually worse than the Poles. I mean, we're getting hints of where sort of German positions are from sort of intercepting their messages. So yes, it was a thing that was raised, but it doesn't look like it's a sort of deal breaker, does it? I mean, given that the success of 303, it's one of the difficulties of trying to have these sort of, you've got your duplicated roles, you've got your sort of British or Canadian officers, and then your Canadians and the Poles, and they're all trying to sort of coordinate with each other in sort of English or French, and then you've got like Kent's got his glossary on his knee. But yeah, in terms of actually them talking in the air, it was a thing. But it's not unexpected. No, these guys, you do have, the Poles that are embedded with the RAF squadrons that came over December, January, and so been training. Their English is much stronger, and they're sort of out of the, if you learn a language, you want to be out of your own language sort of environment, don't you? So these guys are much, much better. But I mean, even in sort of July, Dowding's talking about he would much prefer to have foreign squadrons than the difficulty of trying to embed these foreigners in there. He's very, very hung up on the sort of the language difficulty element of it. So yeah, it kind of comes through, because the Poles, I mean, even when you're looking at sort of the Poles in the First Polish Armoured Division in 44, or, sort of writing in 45, when they've been up in Scotland for 4 years, quite often their English isn't that sound. I mean, it varies massively between individuals and their, how adept they are. And most Poles are sort of at least bilingual, so it's not they can't, but it's that they are in camps with fellow Poles, unless they're sort of dating, for example, they don't really have much opportunity. It's not being sort of ingrained in them to that degree.
Oh, great. I've always wondered.
No repeat please in this one either, though.
Yeah. Oh, come on. It's iconic, isn't it? It's absolutely iconic. Yeah. It's a bit mean to say, but they keep mentioning Angels 1-5 because that's what you say when you've got, enemy on the way. But I just wish I could have watched Angels 1-5.
Altitude 1,500, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's a better film, isn't it? Really, than this one.
The whole RAF jargon's is really, really crucial because there's a big debate on what do the Poles actually need to know. So you've got what your standard sort of instructions. So Angels and Bandits would be part of that. But at the beginning where it starts off with tally ho and you think, oh my God, but obviously that was actually the phrase they would use for we're about to go and engage these guys. Yeah. But to us it sounds so clunky and awful, but the RAF jargon is so very chaptastic, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
Well, there's parts of the film with the dialogue of that isn't explained at all. Now, Hurricane actually does show one of those sort of lessons where the Zombak's character is sort of going through it with them, and it's pancake is land, and Angels is altitude, and various bits and bobs. So you're watching 303 Squadron, and you've got someone over the radio shouting pancake, and if you know that from watching another film or knowing the actual history, you're sat there thinking, why is someone saying pancake?
Talking about their breakfast, you know what I mean?
It's a pancake. What?
Yeah,
that's something that you think they would have explained.
And they even do that in Battle of Britain, don't they? They have a scene that they're doing that too.
Yeah.
It's just a nice little tidbit there that they could have added. It's just a shame that they don't. I think that's probably that seems to be the crux of every point we're making. It's just a shame that they didn't. As I say, I think it's just budgetary restraints and maybe.
What do you think of the uniforms? I quite like the fact that they included the little Polish
that was nice
badge above the RAF wings. Was there a name for that, Jenny?
No, but presumably there is. But God, when you go back to October, November, when they're trying to work out how it's going to work with the Polish Air Force in Britain, and they have to negotiate every bloody aspect. Wow. So it's actually having the sort of the Polish checkerboard. Where do you place that on the plane?
Wow, okay.
Where do you wear your badge? Where do you use the Polish cap badge? And then you obviously have to get them ordered, for example. And then you've got other aspects at the station, where do you have the Polish flag in relation to the British flag, for example? And then they have to do an oath to the King, because they start off as part of the Royal Air Force Voluntary Reserve before they become the independent one sort of later in 1940. So it's there's this big debate on can they swear an oath to both the King and to the Polish Republic and all of this. So all of that element, the uniform and everything is being negotiated at the very highest level really early on. It seems so kind of almost petty to us, given the stakes.
That point of the war where everything's on the line and we're trying to decide whose flag's going to be higher.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's that classic thing of ordering however many 100,000 LDV armbands, and then the next week they're like, oh no, we're going to call it the Home Guard now. We've wasted all this cloth, really important stuff that we need. It's that classic bureaucracy, red tape. We love it in England, don't we? So I think that probably brings us on to favourite scenes.
Jenny is our guest. What's your favourite scene?
I've talked about the one that's just kind of epitomises everything that's wild, where it is the squadron and then this single sort of English chap emerges, and that's kind of just because none of it makes sense. But I think the legitimate one, that not the narky one, is where you've got Stanley Vincent and another evil Brit, I don't know if he even has a name, arrive, and they're sort of, again, kicking back, frustrated that they can't get up in the air. And they say, okay, well, let's just see what the Poles can do. Again, a bit weirdly, Zumbach then volunteering to go up in a hurricane for the first time. Again, they've been training on these, for heaven's sake. But anyway, so he gets to go up in a hurricane for the first time, having never been in. And you think, well, that's a wild way of training pilots, isn't it? I mean, this is an expensive bit of kit. Yeah. We're not going to tell him how it works. We're not going to tell him how to turn it on, or we're not going to mention the retractable wheels, anything. And he gets in, and then again, it's like, okay, so what are we testing here? So he goes up, and that scene is beautiful. I mean, he sort of, taxis and takes off, and then he's up through the clouds, and that is just such a beautiful scene. But again, you're thinking, what are we trying to prove? That what he's able to land, and therefore is that winning? Is that not? I mean, he's out of sight for this entire experiment.
Yeah, there's a little bit in there where the RAF officer goes, he's gone above the clouds, we can't see him. Like, well, what were you expecting him to do? Am I right in thinking that is the only time we see them taxi and actually take off and fly the Hurricane? Ooh. Because all others just seem to sort of like jump into cut scenes of the CGI and the cockpit scenes.
Yeah, I think you might be right there.
It's one of the few, I think, where you do actually see him take off. There's obviously the one where he escapes in that blue plane.
He's in the romantic scene with Yagoda, and like she's an aviation engineer, and he's, I swear to God, explained to her what the instrument panel does, and he's leaving that goddamn cockpit without a black eye. I don't know what's going on, because that was
especially when she's introduced as the lecturer.
Yeah, but she was talking about direct fuel injection. Yeah. I mean, she's the daughter of the goddamn, clearly the sort of the plane guru in Poland. I mean, what, you're telling me how a plane works? No, that grated.
The scripting's so bizarre in places, so weird, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, they make a lot of that direct fuel injection thing, and it's the Germans have had direct fuel injection for 2 years, and then they go, the Hurricane doesn't have direct fuel injection, and you're thinking, is this important? Do I need to?
It's like they're trying to dig at the Hurricane for like no reason. Yeah. You're like, why are you trying to dig at the Hurricane? Like, that's not the problem of the movie. But
then he lands and he goes, it was great. The plane's great, and
he pulls out his Waterstone special hardback Hurricane manual.
Yeah. I mean, that scene is great for the cinematography, isn't it? As you were saying, Jenny. But God, like the fact that there's dialogue in there is like, I hope the manual is in there. Like, no, there wouldn't be a manual in the plane. There wouldn't be an English manual or a Polish manual.
Where are you going to pull over to check a manual?
Yeah.
That was like the joke that the Polish guy's playing is just like, I'm sure I'll read the manual when it's up in the air. I thought it was humour.
Yeah, I
mean, I could be overstating it massively, and it's massively overestimating the intelligence there. But I was kind of.
And then he hands me with a bullet hole through it.
It's so weird. Yeah, and I did pause because you can buy that manual, so that's just something they've got like from a bookshop. It just looked really weird, Anyway,
it's got that Gil Sans font that all the reproductions use, doesn't
it? Yeah. If it had been a Haynes manual, that would have been hilarious. But
Oh, can I just put in another scene that I did?
Of course you can.
You're the guest.
So there's Athel Forbes. So, I mean, we'll just assume that he's had a terrible relationship so far and been this very stuck-up Brit, but somehow he's now won over to them, and that's fine. And he swaps his uniform, doesn't he, for the Polish uniform and the Orchard to give him better luck with the ladies. And that actually did happen. You've got like quite a few sort of court cases where people have done like this, men have done this sort of prolonged fraud pretending to be Polish airmen and to sort of, win a woman or get money out of them and so forth. And you've got cases like in Blackpool where people would put in Polish accents to sort of have greater success with the women. So that scene I did like a lot. I just thought that was, we were talking about the sort of the pulling power of the Polish airmen and that sort of novelty element. Again, you've got that thing with the RP though. They go to the Orchard pub and it's like a finishing school has descended on the place.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Matilda. Hello, Stefan.
Hello.
Yes. So I quite liked that element of it. The relationship with Victoria Brown, I mean, just doesn't hold for me at all. And I mean, she goes from being like not very keen to see the Poles die to really not wanting them to die, but it's not like the greatest, most charitable sort of character arc, is it?
Not really.
No one has a great arc, really, do they? No one's given. I think the guy that gets the best arc is probably the German ace. from like in a weird way. If you think about it, you know, because his scenes are so small. Maybe, I don't know. Like, I'm not trying to be
it's weird, isn't it?
Sympathize or anything.
For such a small cast of central characters, with a lot of people around the edges that you sort of don't know who they're supposed to be or what their role is, it does feel like no one gets a great deal of development.
There's no
obviously it's
breathing
only
room for
spanning
anyone.
a year, from September 39 to September 40, but within that time they've fought in 2 campaigns. They've escaped, their homeland is occupied, and we're not getting a lot of this nuance, I don't think.
No, and you could have picked like 3 people, had them escape, had them fight in the Polish Air Force against the Luftwaffe in 39, had them escape, then had them coming over and facing the adversity, and will they be allowed to fly, will they not? And then finally at the end, oh no, they do get to fly, and oh my god, they're so brilliant. It just narrowed down your characters, and the film will be better off for it. It's not like these guys aren't interesting enough on their own.
We're trying to get the whole, the British were suspicious of the Poles. I mean, in the first place, it was like these really sort of proper security concerns. Like, you've got all these guys arriving. Well, they've got no paperwork deliberately because they've had to like get rid of it and then travel on fake documentation from Romania. And so how the hell do we know? And then there's sort of big concerns about bringing Polish mechanics in and like working on Spitfires or working on sort of, sensitive production. So that was in place. I mean, almost before, I think it might even be September 939, they work out that if they give all the Poles arriving the same block of passport numbers, they'll be able to monitor them. So there is security there. But the idea that you've got this weird MI5 conspiracy, it's like, why do you not have a Dowding character who legitimately does express his concerns about the Poles and being really sort of hostile to the Poles sort of coming in? It seems weird to not have Dowding. And you've got, the sort of the British and the Canadian sort of officers in 303 aren't really made much of either. No. So you've just got like this evil guy who hates the Poles and wants to I think they've had enough, honestly. I don't know where you want to take them. I mean, they've lost everything. They're now fighting for Germany. That's literally it. Where are we going with this?
He's like a villain when there's no need for a villain.
Yeah, it's very odd.
It's so weird.
There's so much they could have done, as you've said, Jenny, that to bring out that friction with the British authorities at the beginning, and all these elements of they would have been in bombers, or can we trust them? Who are they, etc. There's so much that could have been sort of included in the film that is just sort of ignored and left by the wayside.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
I mean, I've got a quote here, which I mean, like, we're talking about, if you want a proper callous Brit, they could do that. I mean, so we've got some Air Ministry's discussions about, right, we'll make them operational in August because we need them, but we don't really want them. It's not ideal. And so it's talking about, okay, so they're being formed out of operational necessity. And then they're saying, right, okay, so if the casualties are higher than anticipate, then we'll just withdraw the Poles and Czechs from the RAF squadrons. But if they're lower, right, well, okay, they can be employed in RAF squadrons or ferrying. And then the quote is, until they are required to fill dead men's shoes. I mean, this is, official sort of correspondence between sort of various departments. They have that callousness. So don't get me wrong, but it's just weird to make it as this pantomime villain rather than to make it an actual sort of British character that's actually, sort of expressing these views. It's yeah.
I suppose it's that it's a sort of operational approach to it, and they're being realistic in that they don't know what kind of resource these pilots are going to be. But there is obviously some of that, prejudice of the foreigner in there as well. But that kind of nuance just isn't captured in this film. It's captured a little bit better in Hurricane, perhaps, because it does show RAF pushback, and it does mention the fact that they should be going into bombers, etc. And that does handle it a little bit better. But in this film, that nuance just isn't there.
Like, Dowding's fine with like French and Belgians joining RAF squadrons, but it really doesn't want the Poles and the Czechs. I mean, that is basic But I mean, I think early on they talk about, they've lost two wars, and that did sort of stick to them as an assumption that there is something fundamentally wrong with not necessarily their training or discipline, but probably both those. But also, this idea that they've been basically sort of flying tiger moths. So you're just thinking, I mean, the Polish planes were pretty damn good, and they are very adept as pilots. But yeah, I mean, you've got all these reports written sort of 38, 39, written for the British Air Ministry about how good the training is and how good the Poles are and how good their airfields are and so forth. But it never sort of filters through to the front lines. Sort of Johnny Kent's there saying that he had no idea. All he knew about the Poles was that they'd been wiped out in 3 days, which again isn't quite fair. But you're just like, it's this communication sort of breakdown.
I think perhaps as well it's that whole thing where, over the decades where we sort of, the way the Polish experience of the Second World War gets presented in like the West, it's like, oh, they got steamrolled in a couple of days. It's that whole myth thing, which is completely unfair. So maybe it's just that, maybe it's just lazy writing again, where they can't be bothered to tell the actual truth or go and research it properly. They just want to write what they feel. In a historical movie, you can't really do that.
I mean, I do think that's just one of the most unforgivable things in this film, that they don't show the Poles fighting back.
Which is weird considering the audience it was made for. It seems that you would show that.
Yeah.
You would want to show the reality of what actually happened, rather than that stereotype of them being steamrolled, as Rob said. But it's just they don't do it. Yeah,
because the Polish experience is fascinating. Like Roger Morehouse's book First to Fight. It's just it's incredible. You're like, please tell me more. And then this movie just doesn't. You're like, oh, okay. It's just disappointing.
Well, on that note, Rob, what was your favourite scene?
Oh, Christ. Well, yeah, I was racking my brains, and it's more of a favourite piece of dialogue, because I think the dialogue's not great the whole way through, really, but there are some bits in there that's quite nice.
It might be great in the original Polish.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, of course. But there's a bit where it's really early on, and a Heinkel or a Junkers transport plane comes down into the German airfield, and Goering gets out. And I was like, wow, that's a dead ringer for Goering. Like, it really looks like him. He's there in his cream suit that he famously wore. And he's sort of like, there's this sort of like slimy Nazi, lieutenant or whatever. And he's sort of like cozying up to Goering, trying to be a bit of a toady. And Goering smoking this big fat cigar. And the guy goes, oh, I love the smell of a good cigar. And Goering turns around and goes, I love the smell of burning British aircraft. And it made me laugh. So I was like, wow, that's cold. Like, such a evil villain line. I really liked it. And I quite like the likeness of the chap who played Goering. I thought that was quite good. Never thought I'd be praising Goering on the show, but there we have it. But that was my little standout there. I just like that bit of dialogue. It's quite nice. And the bit at the end where he's on vinyl and he's giving it to that chap in the bed. It's really weird,
I think that's supposed to be a motivational speech.
Yeah, it reminded me, in Death of Stalin, where they're trying to re-record the
concert, yeah.
The concert, yeah, it reminded me of that a little bit. I was just thinking there's like two German sort of lads trying to be like, we need to record this for this one guy. It just was a bit weird to me. But yeah. And how he's like, get me the head of that British bulldog. It's like, okay. I can kind of buy that dialogue there. It was all right, But yeah, that's my favourite little bit there. What about you, Matt? Have you decided on one?
Well, I've struggled with this one. I mean, there's some standout weird scenes, where the king sort of gets handed the squadron mascot dog.
And he says really woodenly, doesn't he? Now I know that we'll win the war.
Yeah. Like, and I'm starting to feel a bit Polish myself. And you're like, okay.
Right, yep. It's no Colin Firth, was he, that chap?
No. But yes, I mean, one of the bits I thought was, fun. There's a bit where one of the RAF officers goes up with them, and he says, "This one's mine," and he sort of follows a Messerschmitt. Doesn't quite manage to down him. Then a Pole sort of swoops in and takes the kill. So steals his kill, and he's like, "Bloody Pole!" And then a little bit later in that dogfight, there's a German plane on his tail, and the same Polish pilot sort of saves him. And he's like, bloody balls. And it's that moment where he's sort of like flipped. It's a little bit sort of clunkily done, but I see what they were going for. And, you know, it's quite good. It's better than just having a piece of dialogue where someone goes, oh, you're all right, you Polish pilots, you know, which is what I think Hurricane does. But yeah.
And it's in the Fiedler book as well, that. So there's this big doubt that the Poles are just massively inflating their kill rates. So Stanley Vincent does actually go up with them. And then in the book, again, it's talking about, he lands and goes, oh my God, they're really doing it, sort of thing. And again, that would probably have been a better line than he suddenly pledges undying love for the Poles, which does seem a little bit of a sort of conversion.
That again highlights the fact that I didn't know that he was supposed to be playing Stanley Vincent, or that was the character's name, because we don't get introduced to people in a way that sort of sticks.
We found some positives, which was, touch and go there for a little bit. But yeah, so I think that brings us into final thoughts as always. So Jenny, would you like to wrap up for us?
Big thing is, like, you've got these two films come out, focus specifically on 303 from the same source material, and they both seem to go out of their way to miss all the best bits. Not only like this, like the story of how the sort of Poles fight the Germans, withdraw to Romania, escape from internment camps, make their way to France. Some of them fly in France, make their way back to the UK, not even back to the UK for the first time, for heaven's sake. And then the sort of challenges they face. That's a flipping good story. Don't just sort of give me some evil chap sneering at the Poles. If you want us to feel sympathy, you need to give us something to work with here. And then also, there's the point where, two films about 303. It's a good story, and yes, you're missing the best bit of the source material. But there's so many brilliant stories. Like the whole of Europe is sort of listening to the radio set when the submarine, the Orgel, escapes from Estonia, and then it's sort of without charts and without ammunition, without water, manages to navigate its way to the UK, for example. So that's a flipping brilliant story. There's the whole sort of the first Polish Armoured Division. I've got a friend who I know is trying to get a film made about this at the moment. But like Hill 262, where you've got, the first Polish Armoured Division holding out against the entire sort of German 7th Army trying to escape from the Falaise Gap. It's a brilliant story waiting to be told. And he said we get these two which are okay, but they've been done, and the Battle of Britain really just did it all better effortlessly in one single scene. So just what are we doing, really?
I think that sums it up, doesn't it? It's a missed opportunity.
Does feel like it massively, and it's a bit of a shame, because this is what I always say. I'm going to say it again. I'll say it every bloody week, so till people are annoyed about me saying it. But these movies are really important. They have to do right by their subject matter, because if someone who knows nothing about the Poles and their amazing wartime heroics and their sacrifices and things, if someone comes away from this movie now thinking, oh, what did the Poles actually do? Why are they that important? Why are they making two movies about them? That's really unfair. These movies can't be like this movie that we've just watched, because it gives an unfair portrayal of the people. And if we're going to use movies going forward to do more representation and remembrance, as I feel like these films should be made for, then I just think it's such a shame. And I think that's why I came away so dumbfounded with this movie, with 303 Squadron at least. I was just like, well, for a Polish movie to do the Poles dirty, for me, it's just really weird. I don't know, like, who the audience is for. I don't know, like, some of the choices made for the movie are just really bizarre. And I think just, my base feeling is just that it's just a poor representation of events and a poor film.
It doesn't feel like a coherent narrative, in that there's so much in there that doesn't really need to be in there. There's elements that just feel like they've been included because they thought that plot point would work, but then it fell flat, or perhaps things were cut out. But as we said, like the CGI, some of it isn't bad. Some of the cinematography with the Hurricane in flight was really good. So it's got its plus points and it's got its negatives. I think actually it'd be interesting if you watch both this and Hurricane. They perhaps fill in some gaps and sort of complement each other in a weird way. obviously the plots are quite different, and the approaches to some of the characters, such as Zumbak's, are quite different. But yeah, it's a bit of a disappointment, I think, in that it doesn't do the subject matter and the actual pilots and aircraft crew the justice that really does need to be done for them. And as you say, Jenny, there's so many other great stories from the Polish experience of World War II that could be told.
What more can you say about these films? I mean, Jenny, is there anything you'd like to add finally before we wrap up? Stunned silence on Fighting on Film for once. Yeah.
I mean, I do. Oh no! I mean, I really do admire the attempt to sort of try and fuse the British and the Polish experience. And I think we were saying, like, they don't know who the audience is, but they're trying to cram so much, and they and it's like they lost sight of everything, wasn't it? You've got, like, you're trying to bring out the Battle of Britain's significance for Britain. You're trying to bring out, the sort of the Polish experience, and you're trying to sort of bring in this sort of experience of this squadron. And there's so much that they could have done, and they lost the plot, really, didn't they? When there's sort of just storyline. Was there a storyline? Did they just throw it up in the air? See what? I don't know. Yeah. But it is such a sort of, as you say, missed opportunity for, I think, possibly the 25th time today.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I tweeted out earlier that before we started recording, does this one hit the heights or does it fail at takeoff? And I think this one did fail at takeoff. And there you go. I mean, thanks for joining us, Jenny. It's been brilliant talking to you and actually being able to learn a little bit more about the Polish experience throughout the episode. That's been really, really interesting. And yeah, thank you for joining us.
No, thanks for the invite. It's been fun. It's fun.
Brilliant. And we'll have to get you on for another Polish film.
Brilliant. Yes, definitely.
So, Jenny, where can people find you on Twitter and on online if they want to learn more about the Polish experience?
So on Twitter, my handle is Silence in Polish, which, Battle of Britain fans might recognise. But yeah, Silence in Polish, that'd be great. Thank you.
No problem. Be sure to check Jenny out because her work is absolutely fabulous. So as always, you can like, share, subscribe to the show, give us a review on whatever you're listening on, and we'll catch you again next time. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Bye.